So what this talk is about, it's about doing Agile transformations. And my name is Mike Hotmeyer, and I own a company called Leading Agile that we're based out of Atlanta, Georgia. And what we fundamentally do is help companies orchestrate transformation. And you'll get a sense for what I mean by that as we get into this a little bit. Who in the audience is going through some sort of Agile transformation right now? Cool. Who thinks it's going awesome? Okay, cool. You guys are in the right place, because let it note for the live stream that like nobody in the office. I can't talk today. This is going to be a long 45 minutes. Nobody in the auditorium said that they thought their talk was or their transformation was going awesome. So anyway, since I only have 45 minutes, I'm going to tell you the end of the story first, and then I'm going to support all of my points after that, right? So to me, I think we're getting Agile transformation wrong in our industry right now, because we're focusing on either A, changing how people think, right, how they approach the work, or B, the things that they do, okay? And so what my assertion for this talk is that Agile transformation is fundamentally about changing the ecosystem in your company so that you can actually do Agile. Okay? Because my belief is that there's a lot of barriers in organizations. Some of them necessary, some of them unnecessary, some of them, core, some of them ancillary, things that actually just deeply get in the way. And so removing those impediments is the work of the transformation. So it's less about changing the people, less about changing what they do, and more about changing their environment. So Agile transformation for me is deciding how you're going to do that, okay? And so what the first part of this talk is really going to go into is what are the things that you need to consider when you're looking at the scope of a transformation, okay? And then we're going to talk a little bit about how to think through your transformation approach and what the work of an Agile transformation is. And then last but not least, and this is only a maybe, we'll get into like how to like set it up and manage change. If I had another 30 or 40 minutes, there's like a whole like second half of the deck that we could go into, and I pushed all that content in the back. So if you guys hit our website afterwards, I've got the deck already up, and you guys can get access to the video and stuff like that at leadingagile.com. So all that stuff will be up there, and you'll get access to all the slides that I'm probably not going to get to today. So anyway, so deciding the scope of the transformation. This might sound obvious, but the first thing when you're thinking about doing a transformation that you want to consider is why. And again, I'm going to apologize for the slide. It's kind of hard to read up here. But basically, depending upon the goals of your transformation, what business problem you're trying to solve, that's going to shift the flavor of the Agile that you do. When I first started getting into Agile, as developers, we think about culture and environment and having a great place to work and being empowered and all that kind of stuff. Or sometimes we'll upgrade that a little bit to we want to be able to be innovative and responsive to our customers and making sure that we're building the right thing. Okay? That all makes perfect sense. Most of the phone calls that we get when it comes to wanting to do an Agile transformation are actually more around like predictability. Being able to make and meet commitments, being able to get things in market earlier so we can start to sell them, building quality into the system as we go. Okay, let's say predictability, quality, early return investment. Oh, and then lower costs, right? I knew I was missing one. So lower costs, right? Lower costs are really dicey when it comes to Agile because, you can do things more efficiently and you can make sure that you're building the right product and that you can put product into market and get money for it faster. But most organizations we work with are so overloaded that, just the idea of using it as a cost play is really tough. But understanding your business drivers, right, is going to shift how you think about orchestrating your transformation, okay? So if you guys are in charge of doing a transformation, first thing is to understand what your business drivers are. You good back there? Okay, cool. So the next thing I want you guys to ask is, what are you transforming? What is your transformation hypothesis? And what I think is that there's three main kind of hypotheses that you encounter in Agile talks and from Agile thinkers and people that are writing books and things like that. And the first one that I see quite often is the culture-focused transformation. Okay? Anybody think if they could just change the culture in their organization that things would just be just fantastic? Right? Culture is kind of like the silver bullet, because as soon as you try anything, you hit resistance. Right? You hit the way people work, the way people behave. And so it's easy to start to think about, well, if I could just get the culture right, everything else would be better. What I would suggest, though, is if you approach from a culture-first kind of perspective, you're making a certain assumption. If I could just get everybody's hearts and minds and behaviors and actions and all that stuff changed, that the system of delivery, right, the way we work and everything would naturally get better. Okay? It might be a valid hypothesis in a small organization, but I would suggest that it's really tough to change 300 or 400, let alone 3,000 or 4,000 or 30,000 or 40,000 people's cultural stuff all at one time. Okay? So, but just know that when you decide to do a culture-first transformation, you're making a bet. You're making a bet that if you can get everybody's hearts and minds and such changed, that goodness and all those business benefits will flow from it. Okay, so just be aware of that. The other way that we tend to see this is a practices-focused kind of a thing. Like if I show up for Scrum Master School, right, and I learn how to do daily stand-ups, all the goodness will flow. If I learn how to do better retrospectives, all the goodness will flow. Or if I learn how to do TDD or other technical practices, or I learn pair programming or continuous integration and deployment, right? It can be business or technically related. The hypothesis is as if you have skills, that all of the goodness will flow from that, right? That will solve the business problem. Okay? And what we see is that in a lot of cases, the challenge is that people start working on culture, or they start working on practices, and they don't actually get the business benefits. They don't actually get more predictability. They don't actually get faster time to market. They don't actually get cost savings or the ability to innovate, right? They get the ability to do Scrum, right? They get the ability to do retrospectives and things like that, but they don't necessarily lead to the business benefits that we all promised from adopting Agile. And what I think is that the word systems, I vacillate around this word quite a lot, whether it be systems or structure or something like that. But what I believe is that there's organizational patterns in most organizations that get in the way of our ability to do Agile. Okay? How we form teams, how we govern, what are all the upstream and the downstream things that are going on in the enterprise. Okay? Our technical architectures, our business architectures, are the way we assign people to projects and teams, right? All that kind of stuff gets in the way. And so my general hypothesis is that culture in the absence of a viable delivery ecosystem to do this isn't going to work. Okay? Practices in the absence of a viable ecosystem to do this stuff isn't going to work. Okay? So my general bent is that culture emerges from that viable ecosystem. The practices only make sense within that viable ecosystem. And so if we're going to introduce Agile at scale, if we're going to introduce Agile into any kind of non-trivial environment, we've got to deal with the underlying system dysfunctions and then begin to start installing the practices, and then to start to kind of coach and encourage people to change their hearts and minds. Okay? And I think as an industry, we tend to think about that opposite. Like if we get the culture right, the practices and the structure stuff will begin to flow from it. Okay? And my, kind of my underlying hypothesis is that, DC, right, real big in the government space. We do a lot of work up in the Detroit area, real big in automotive space. Southeast, we get a lot of banks and things like that where there's just a lot of legacy. Okay, there's a lot of things that get in the way. And attacking that stuff that gets in the way head on is really the work of doing the transformation. So that's where I was kind of going next, is what do we need to overcome? And what I would suggest, and I apologize that this slide's washed out. There's a couple of these that are coming up that are going to be pretty washed out for you guys. But basically what I'm trying to get off on this slide is that doing a transformation of a single development team is different than doing the transformation in a large automotive manufacturing firm, right? A couple of teams working in a division of a large software organization is really different than trying to transform an entire bank. Okay? So the size of what you're doing the transformation on matters. Okay? The order of magnitude of the organization matters. And this is unfortunate that this slide's kind of washed out, so I'm going to walk through this a little bit more than I might have given that we only have 45 minutes. But one of the biggest things that we see in most organizations is that we form teams, but teams have dependencies between them. Anybody dealing in an organization where there's lots of dependencies? Okay? Dependencies are going to kill your ability to be agile. Right? I mean, if you think about it, what Agile fundamentally is, it's the ability to respond to new information when you learn things. It's the ability to get feedback and to use that feedback to improve. And if everything is coupled together, it makes it incredibly difficult to have any degrees of freedom. Okay? And so what I've got up here are things like non-instantly available resources, matrixed organizations, limited access to subject matter expertise, shared requirements between teams, technical debt and defects, low cohesion, tight coupling, large products with diverse technology stacks, too much work in process, right? Those are the 8 that were just on the top of my mind when I built this slide a couple years ago. One time I was doing this talk for a room full of CIOs in Atlanta. One brave CIO raises his hand, he goes, yeah, but that's like my organization. Right? I mean, what you just highlighted, and I said, but yeah, if you want to do Agile, that's the stuff you got to fix. Right? I mean, it's like there's tons of ways to work, right? I mean, Agile's not the only way to deliver projects, okay, or deliver, product work, right? But if you're going to choose to do Agile, and you want the benefits of doing Agile, right, then dealing with this kind of stuff in the organization is what's going to get in the way of being agile. One of the last iterations of this talk I did was called The Executive's Guide to Leading an Agile Transformation. And the focus is how do we get our executives to move in this direction and support removing the kinds of impediments that we need them to remove. And what I asserted in that talk is that we have to be upfront and direct with them. Because what we're doing is when we take like a practices or a culture-based approach to doing transformation, is what we're saying is that let the teams start operating in an agile way, let them start thinking in an agile way, and then that iterative and incremental process with retrospectives kind of anchoring it is going to show us our impediments, and then we'll fix the impediments and we'll get better, right? Sounds like a reasonable hypothesis. But what about when that impediment is a 50-year-old COBOL mainframe that's like basically driving billions of dollars of transaction revenue? And you go, you need to refactor your mainframe. And they go, yeah, right, okay? But those are the kinds of things we're up against, right? Those are the kinds of impediments that you see in large-scale transformation work, right? And so being able to deal with that effectively is a big part, right? And so as we engage our executives in these kinds of conversations, we have to be real about what they're going to get by doing Agile, what kind of impediments that they're going to see, what kinds of investments are they going to have to overcome, right? Are going to have to make to overcome some of these impediments, right? That kind of a thing, okay? So then the third thing that I want you guys to think about when you're taking this kind of stuff into consideration is how much resistance you're going to get in the organization. Right? A lot of times you'll see a lot of excitement down at the team level, and you'll see, maybe some excitement at the senior executive level, but then what do we talk about? We love to talk about middle managers in our world, right? All those middle managers in the world, they get threatened and they don't want to do this. Well, I mean, I think there's like some legit concern, right? I mean, I've worked with a lot of director and VP level architecture types, and we're telling them about all the benefits of iterative and incremental and continuous integration and delivery and DevOps and all this stuff, and they're looking at this big mess of code that they've got, and that they know that without like multiple years and a lot of millions of dollars in investment, that stuff's not going to get any better, right? So a lot of times there's a lot of cognitive dissonance going on that we have to deal with. Okay? And so when you're thinking about a transformation, right, where I want you guys to anchor right now is, understand what business problem that you're trying to solve, because that's going to shape the trade-off decisions you make when you're going through this. Understand the size of the organization and the scope of the number of kinds of things that you're going to touch. If you're a small encapsulated team within a large organization, you don't have gigantic problems. Unless you got dependencies, right? If you're trying to transform an entire organization, right, you got to think about the world a little bit differently, okay? If you've got lots of dependencies, dependencies are going to get in the way. And then you've got to make a bet to say, is the organization going to be able to self-organize those dependencies out of the system? Or are those things going to long-term get in the way of our ability to get the benefits of being agile? Okay? And then last but not least, the amount of resistance that we're going to get into the organization. So for me, all of those things start to set up the scope of the transformation. Make sense? Okay? Cool. So let's talk about how we're going to define a transformation approach. And again, this is like the worst sequence here as far as being washed out on the screen. So again, just apologizing in advance. And so what that says on the screen, if you could read it, is the non-negotiable core. Okay? And if anybody's ever heard me speak, just out of curiosity, anybody ever heard me speak before? All right, a bunch of new people and a few repeats. Thanks for guys for coming back. So one of the things that I talk about a lot and that I use as a litmus test for us being on the right track for adopting Agile is this thing I call the three things. And by the three things, I mean backlogs, teams, and working tested software. Okay? And a lot of times you can look at what an organization is doing with Agile. And if you get past how well they're doing Scrum or retrospectives or burn down charts or the safe stuff, right? All the trappings of Agile. And if I get right to the core, right, I start looking for, can they build a backlog that meets a certain kind of criteria? Okay? And when I say a certain kind of criteria, the whole point of a backlog is to break the work up into little itty bitty bits so that we can get them in front of the customers fast and get feedback on them. Okay? So when I was doing a lot of day-to-day kind of Scrum training back in my version 1 days in the early days of leading Agile, what I would do is that I would teach people how to write user stories this way. Okay, and they had certain attributes, and they were structured in a certain way, and they were meant to be interchangeable. So I go back to Bill Wake's Invest, right? And independent, negotiable, valuable, estimatable, small, and testable. The rule of thumb is that you could do a handful of them in the course of a sprint. They were the kinds of things that a Scrum team could swarm around and get done. They actually would burn down through the course of a sprint or through the course of a release. Okay, that's what a backlog item is. And so if you can't write backlog items like that, then chances are, right, that team is not going to be able to do Agile well. Tons of organizational reasons why, right? How we're governed, how we do projects, how we're making and meeting commitments, the upstream and downstream dependencies, the lack of product ownership within the organization, the inability of anybody authoritative to make a decision, right? On and on and on and on, right? But when you take it to just the simplest thing, does that team have a backlog? First time I did the talk that had this in it, was called The Three Things, and I did it at a Scrum gathering, I want to say in Vegas, and 500 Scrum enthusiasts in the room, and I'm like, who writes backlogs like this? And like 3 out of 500 raised their hand. And if you start to think about it, everything in Scrum fails in the absence of a good backlog, right? You can't do sprint planning right. You can't do daily stand-ups right. You can't do demos right. You can't do reviews and retrospectives right. The tracking and the metrics around it doesn't work, okay? The whole sprint planning process in and of itself will begin to break down in the absence of a good backlog, okay? And there's this tendency in Scrum to want to say, well, if you want a good backlog, you need a product owner. I bet you everybody in this room has a product owner, but I bet you very few of you have good backlogs. Okay, so just calling somebody a product owner doesn't get you a good backlog. I would rather have I can think of 18 different constructs for producing backlogs and none of them involve a product owner. But I have to have the backlog. I don't necessarily need somebody called a product owner to build the backlog. Okay, so then the second thing that's kind of a litmus test is this idea of teams. A team, very specific construct in Agile, right? 6 to 8 people have everything and everyone necessary to deliver what's in the backlog. Ideally, they're co-located, although technology is enabling us to break that rule more and more lately. But the idea that you have this group of people that have everything and everyone necessary to be able to deliver what's in the backlog, and I would say with very few dependencies. A good Agile team can deal with some lightweight dependency management, but when you're dealing with architectural issues and cross-cutting concerns and things that are beyond the scope of the team, you want to move into the cloud, DevOps, right? All this different stuff that maybe or maybe not you're empowered to do, right? So the challenge is that if I can't form a team that way, right, then I'm not going to be able to stabilize my throughput against the backlog. Okay? That team, has anybody ever worked on a team where everybody was part-time? Right? Has anybody ever seen that kind of a team stabilize velocity or throughput? They never do, and they never will. Right? I mean, it's beyond the scope of a 45-minute talk to go into why, but time and time and time again, if you try to form teams that are not dedicated, you will never stabilize your velocity. And if you can't stabilize your velocity, you have no idea where you're at against that backlog. You have no idea when you're going to be done. Just don't. Okay, so just own that. Okay, so I know forming teams is hard. It might be impossible, but nothing else is going to work unless you're able to do that. Okay? The last little bit is the idea of this working tested software, right? So if I was dealing with actually, I have so many stories to tell you guys that I'm just kind of blowing through, but you can generalize that. It doesn't have to be software. It can be any kind of validatable product or anything like that. Actually just did a little engagement with a storage management company. I don't mean like data storage. I mean like literally like a self-storage place that wanted to adopt Agile. It was the craziest little thing ever, right? But it was cool, right? It was fun. And so it might be watching this, so I'd be really embarrassed if they heard me say that about them. But anyway, this idea of a working, tested, validated product, right? The idea is that if I know what's in my backlog and I know my rate of throughput, and I can get to like a really solid definition of done, I can start to anticipate completion. Right? I can start to say, got 100 points in the backlog, I can do 10 points a sprint, it's going to take me roughly 10 sprints to get this done. If I only have 5 sprints left, I can get about 50% of the way through the backlog. What 50% do you want, right? Those are the kinds of conversations that we want to be able to have in a simple form. In the absence of being able to get to a definition of done, you don't know the progress you're making. And again, right, the larger, the more complex the environment, the harder it is to get to a meaningful definition of done at the end of the sprint. Okay? So what I'm doing is I'm building the case that in the absence of having clarity about what to build, in the absence of having the ability to hold yourself accountable or to be held accountable, the absence of being able to measure progress, all this stuff stops working. Right? On the other side, the idea of purpose, autonomy, and mastery. I don't know if anybody's ever read Dan Pink's stuff around this, right? But it gets into like, what do knowledge workers want, right? It's not just about money at some point, right? It's they want to show up and they want to be aligned to the value that the organization produce. They want to be able to demonstrate that they're good at it and that they have the ability to do it, right? I mean, just on and on, right? There's so much just wisdom underneath Scrum when we get the idea of teams, backlogs, working, tested software right. In the absence of a great backlog, in the absence of a dedicated team, in the absence of the ability to get to a definition of done, I would suggest that almost nothing else is going to work. Okay? So that's why I call that my non-negotiable core. Unless we're tracking to that, then we're just going through the motions. It used to be really popular to talk about cargo cult Scrum a couple years ago, right? Where you're just showing up and just doing Scrum things. Right, but not actually getting the business benefit from Scrum. In every single case, that's actually a pretty big thing to say, in every single case, it's because you violated one of those 3 things. Okay? So that's where we're at. So I'm going to pivot the conversation a little bit and talk a little bit about a model that I introduced a couple years ago. Sometimes we'll call it Leading Agile Compass. Sometimes we call it the Four Quadrants. And what we talk about are organizations that are built for either predictability or adaptability, okay? Without going too deep, companies that are built for predictability have big PMOs, annual planning cycles, right? All that kind of stuff, a lot of infrastructure. Anybody work in an organization that has a big PMO? Really? Nobody else? Wow. Okay, I think you guys are lying to me. Okay, on the other side, you've got the idea of adaptability, right? Small, nimble companies that don't try to do a lot of planning ahead, but can actually like literally sense and respond to their markets. Right? Companies like that exist, right? And it all speaks to the value of the company or the value system of the company. Some companies value big predictable planning cycles. Other companies value adaptability and responding to change. Markets are kind of the same way. As an early Snapchat user, not that I am one actually, but my kids are. So like as an early Snapchat user, we had no idea what Snapchat would look like a couple years after it started, right? It responded to its market and evolved the product based upon what features it could get people to use, right? Really kind of a different model than maybe like tax software or something like that. Imagine there's a lot of people in here that work in the government space, right? You got a big RFP or a contract or a set of specs that you've got to deliver to, right? The language of, well, we're just going to get the best we can until we run out of money, and then, you can give us another couple $1 million, and then, that sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't, right? But the idea is that up on the upper scale, you've got kind of a figure it out as you go, right? On the lower end of the scale, you've got, I want a specific thing, okay? So you've got companies that are built for predictability, companies that are built for change, markets that we can explore, and markets that want a specific thing. And what that kind of implies are these 4 quadrants, right? So I talk about predictive emergent, predictive convergent, adaptive convergent, and adaptive emergent. Okay? And again, right, all these little things have stories. When I first did this in a talk, I was talking about why Agile fails or why transformations are failing. And what happens a lot is that you get, oh, that doesn't work either. Okay. So what happens a lot is you get companies that are up in this upper left quadrant where they're built for predictability, but because they don't either understand their requirements or they're not managing them well or they don't know them or whatever, they feel like the market's changing around them all the time. And so what they do is that they go and they say, okay, well, we're going to do a pilot and we're going to do pure play Scrum, dedicated team, greenfield technology. We're not going to put any of our governance or controls around it, and we're going to let them figure it out as we go, right? And that works until you try to do that model back in the old ecosystem, right? That's built for predictability, right? So what we see is a lot of Agile pilots that were failing because the things that worked in the upper right quadrant didn't work in the upper left ecosystem, right? You could go and do a cool little mobile product up here in the upper right, but when you try to apply the same things to your legacy mainframe, it didn't work, right? Because it's not the processes that make it work, it's the ecosystem that makes it work. It's not the daily stand-up, it's the encapsulated team, right? That kind of a thing, right? And so you can diagnose why every Agile implementation that you've ever been exposed to, why it fails using these kinds of thinking tools, right? Okay, expectations of customers, expectations of the people in the company, the application of the right process to the right ecosystem, on and on. It just gets really super clear. And so talked about this idea of the predictive emergent quadrant, the predictive convergent quadrant, the adaptive convergent quadrant, and the adaptive emergent quadrant. So what I tend to think about is the upper left being somewhat chaotic or heroic. Sometimes I'll say irrational if I'm being kind of provocative. Want to be snarky with the industry, right? Lower left is where you start to see more traditional, more kind of heavyweight models because companies built for predictability. We're trying to get to a very specific kind of a thing. Lower right's where Agile tends to find its home base. Upper right is where like lean startup tends to find its home base. And my assertion is that there's different organizational attributes required, different ecosystem characteristics required to do methodology in each of those 4 quadrants. Okay? So a big part of the story that we want to tell here is that sometimes the ecosystem that you're currently operating in is going to dictate what methodologies that you can choose, okay? The methodology that you want to move towards is going to dictate the changes that you need to make in your ecosystem to get the benefits of that methodology, right? So the methodology and the ecosystem have to be congruent with each other, right? Doing lean startup on a very well-defined, gigantic government thing that has to be done by the end of the month, and we're just like, hey, we're gonna figure it out, right? doesn't always line up, right? Or maybe never lines up. Maybe I was just being generous, right? So, okay, cool. So, kind of my theory of transformation part 2 here. Adopting Agile is about forming teams, building backlogs, and regularly producing working, tested increments of software, okay? And I'm going to introduce something. This is actually a holdover from another talk, but when I talk about like at scale, what I talk about is the idea of defining a structure, establishing a governance framework, and creating a metrics and tooling strategy that enable agility, okay? So how do we form networks of teams at scale? How do we put barely sufficient lightweight governance around them, right? And remember, governance is just like a way of managing economic trade-offs in the face of scarce resources. A product owner is a governance framework for a Scrum team, okay? Governance can be super heavy, governance can be very lightweight. Governance is simply just how we make decisions, right? What do we want to measure and control, and what kinds of things are going to promote agility, and what kinds of things are going to get away from agility, okay? So now that I just basically took 10 slides and collapsed them into 3 sentences. Adopting Agile is about forming teams, building backlogs, producing working tested software. At scale, it's about networks of teams, structure, lightweight governance, metrics and tools that enable agility, okay? So anything that gets in the way of forming teams, building backlogs, producing working tested software is an impediment to your Agile transformation. And I would go so far as to say that the work of an Agile transformation isn't teaching people how to do Agile, it's removing the impediments to doing Agile. Make sense? If you guys buy my teams, backlogs, working tested software story, right, if I had you at that point, then this is inarguable to me. Because otherwise, we're just going to be going through the motions of it, right? Whether it's SAFe, whether it's Scrum, whether it's XP, right? Whatever, okay? So creating the right context to do the methodology that you choose is the work of the transformation, okay? So what we find, and this probably doesn't apply to smaller organizations, because I think smaller organizations or pockets within a larger enterprise can get away with a lot of different kinds of stuff, right? They can probably do a culture-first transformation. They can probably all go to Scrum school and they would be just fine, right? But large organizations going through a structured, systematic transformation are going to have to think about this more intentionally. And so a lot of these organizations start up in this lower left quadrant where they're very low trust. They don't have an ecosystem that's going to enable them to get to the upper right quadrant straight on. Okay, if they want to go to the upper right quadrant straight on, they probably need to go build a parallel organization. Okay, so you see a lot of organizations and large companies building labs groups and different things to go do innovation on the side. The reason why they're doing that is because the ecosystem that they're in can't change fast enough. The mistake they make is when they take the old stuff and they try to bolt the new stuff on top of it and then somehow expect the old stuff to move at the same pace as the new stuff. You see that happen quite a bit. Banking's classic, right? So they can go do like a lab thing for their new mobile site and then they try to inject, changes into the ACH processing engine. And then they can't realize why they can't get the stuff to move on the backside as fast as they could on the front side, right? Ecosystem wasn't in place, okay? So a lot of times the transformation journey actually goes through the lower left quadrant. And we'll talk a little bit more in detail about this, but the idea is that you can use Agile to actually out-project manage the project managers, right? You do out-SDLC the SDLC people. Right, you can, right? You can do team-based, iterative and incremental delivery, create tons of optionality, but you can do it with a lower left quadrant mindset, lower left quadrant point of view. You probably have to because you haven't improved the ecosystem yet. So you want to get a lot of bang for your buck really early, so you do Agile in a lower left quadrant way. Okay, as you improve the system, right, you start to move to the right, you can start thinking about reducing batch size and doing some things. That's where Scrum and SAFe and some of those other things kind of have their home base, right? And then as we continue to improve the ecosystem, we can start to do stuff up in the upper right, okay? Up in the lean startup area. So what charting a journey, right, for this kind of a thing either involves, like I said, going from upper left to upper right or to lower right by building a parallel organization, or it involves helping the organization you have move through the quadrants. Okay, so we've kind of coined this little thing that we call base camps, right? And here I call them phases because I'll try to make it a little bit more generic, especially when we're doing like Agile 2017 conferences and stuff. I don't want to put too much of our specific lingo in it. But we'll talk about phase one is like the first goal of Agile isn't empower everybody, continuous this, continuous that, right? It's about getting predictable. It's about getting good at understanding your backlog. It's about forming teams to the best of your abilities, decoupling, organizing for maximum decoupling between teams, okay? Getting those teams to be able to establish a stable velocity, beginning to introduce some early technical practices, right? Those kinds of things, some at least good testing and continuous testing kinds of things, okay? And then as you move into phase two, right, as we move down the right-hand side, the next step of improvements we want to make are mostly around batch size. So at the portfolio level, that means approving smaller projects, getting things broken down, focusing on minimally marketable, probably reducing your deployment cycles. We're probably not ready for continuous integration or anything like that yet. But there's a lot of things we might be able to do with release management to lean out that delivery cycle, okay? And then we can either kind of camp on step three, right, and just stay squarely in the Agile space. If we don't break those dependencies, we're probably going to be stuck with something like safe. If we want to actually begin to start breaking dependencies, we can start to take advantage of like more team level Scrum kinds of things because we can encapsulate technology components and have teams operating independently, okay? So once we have that, then we can start to think about team-based funding, right? Let me give a team a bucket of money to go solve a problem. You can't do that when everybody's all connected to everybody else, right? So that's why there's this stepwise progression. And then if you really wanted to, then you could take some of those teams and say, go innovate like a lean startup. But you can't get a team innovating like a lean startup until it's decoupled from the rest of the ecosystem, right? So that's kind of the journey, right? So regardless of whether those 5 steps are the right 5 steps for you, or whether it's 3 steps for you, or whether you only want to stay at 1 and 2 and you have no intention of going to 5, what you can do is you can use this thinking tool as a pattern language or like a way of talking about where are we at now, where do we want to go, what does our ecosystem look like now, what improvements do we need to make to be able to get there? And then that starting place and the end place can be broken up into improvement increments. So as you make certain improvements, you can start to see certain kinds of marginal gains in the transformation lifecycle. Okay? I'm telling you, where we're making a mistake in large enterprises is that we're relying on the notional idea that if I teach you Scrum, the impediments will reveal themselves and that the teams will self-organize to fix them. What I'm suggesting is that the kinds of impediments that you're dealing with at scale are executive level investments. Okay? And so if you're going to transform at that level of scale, we have to be transparent with those executives about what the cost of the transformation is going to be and what's the impact and the risk of the transformation. Okay? I would suggest that 80 to 90% of the kinds of things that most organizations are going to experience throughout a transformation are knowable. You don't have to stub your toe over and over and over to go figure it out, right? Right? You can actually plan for them, right? You anchor on that idea. I'm super afraid I'm going to like fall off the step here. I should probably back up. That would be really funny to have on Facebook Live, right? Okay. So anyway, so the idea is that you can anticipate the impediments. You can decide when you want to invest in them. You can decide what kinds of marginal improvements you can get now, which ones you're willing to wait for, which ones are economically viable. And what we find is in a lot of situations, base camps 1 and 2 are sufficient. Okay, I would suggest that for a financial transaction processing engine that's making millions or billions of dollars for a bank, probably does not ever need to be in the upper right quadrant. Does not ever need to operate like a lean startup. Okay, probably needs to sit right down there in the lower left quadrant. The mobile stuff might need to go faster. The web stuff might need to go faster. There's probably tons of applications that need to go faster. But that back end stuff needs to stay right where it's at. Okay? So where are we going, right? So I've kind of been tipping my hat to this a little bit as we go. I kind of did this off the top of my head too. I was thinking like from most heavyweight all the way to like some of the more lightweight kinds of things up here. So I was kind of doing an inventory of methodologies and frameworks, and I was trying to see where would they fit on my map. okay? And I don't know if this is an exact science. It's probably debatable where I place them. I did have my team actually look at it and give me a little bit of feedback on it. But you know, things, agile methodologies that can live in that lower left quadrant tend to be, you know, things that are named, right? Things like FDD, DSDM, RUP. I mean, really debatable whether you want to call that an agile methodology, but you can implement pieces of RUP in a lightweight. It's definitely iterative and incremental. Right? As you move over into the right, sort of large scale Scrum and Nexus and SAFe and Disciplined Agile Delivery and XP and Scrum Live. And then, you know, as you move up into the upper right, probably like Coburn's like crystal clear stuff, maybe some of the Pop and Dick Lean stuff, right? That kind of a thing, right? So again, right, if you've got a methodology, you've picked up a book and you think you like to do that, right? And you'd like to use that as your basis. Like, I don't particularly care, right? They all work if you get the context right. Okay, so figure out which one you need to head to, and then look at the ecosystem around you and say, okay, where are we at practically? And if you want to be upper right and you really need to be, and you're really stuck in lower left, right, then it limits your choices. Either that or go build a labs group over on the side. Okay, so kind of like the point of this like first section. I'm trying to say I've got like 5 minutes left, so I'm probably going to have to kind of stop here, but I'll show you what's in the rest of the deck, right? Is if you take like a company one, right, and like look at all the different things that we talked about, size and dependencies and things like that. So if you have 3 teams with no dependencies, very low resistance to change, you're really looking at a team level transformation. They're up in the upper right adaptive emergent quadrant, maybe a single value stream, want to do lean startup, low coordination between teams, low metrics and control. Right? You can imagine the kinds of things that you might do to design a transformation for that group. Versus 800 teams, tightly coupled, high levels of resistance in the organization, enterprise-wide, predictive convergent, right? That's that lower left quadrant, lots and lots of value streams, maybe wants to do SAFe as their end state. They have a very high coordination, you know, high control kind of culture, high metrics and control from a delivery perspective, right? Those are going to be 2 very different kinds of things, okay? So where this talk goes in kind of a longer format, just to give you guys kind of an idea, is that there's different kinds of teams across organizations. They can be organized into different kinds of patterns. They can be governed using different methodologies, and I really, again, apologize, hit the website and you guys can get the deck. And then we talk about this idea of iterative and incremental transformation. Okay, and an increment of a transformation, right? If you think down to like Patton's Mona Lisa's, everybody seen that diagram? Like where an increment is like take a chunk, an iteration is like a progressive level of maturity. So that thing that I just talked about where you go from phase 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, that's a way of iterating through your organization and getting like a minimally viable agile implementation. It's not where we ultimately want to be, but it's where we can start. So what we talk about is that the work of a transformation, the work of improving, like doing, you know, removing impediments over time, or maybe the unit of value, that's the word I'm looking for. The unit of value of a transformation is like we call it an expedition, right? It's a group of teams, right? A value stream maybe that moves through this iterative approach to transformation. And what's really cool about it, right, is that when you think about transformation work as an incremental and iterative process where you're moving pieces of the organization through progressive levels of maturity, okay, then you can start to think about using Scrum to implement Agile or to implement Scrum. One of the big problems we have is we use Scrum processes to manage a backlog of activities, right? That happens all the time in Agile, right? The unit of value, the epic and the user story level stuff is not send people to Scrum Master School, not send somebody to CSPO training. It's, I need to move this set of teams to this level of maturity so it produces this marginally increased business value. Right? That's the unit, right? That's the backlog. Right? The work is, okay, I got to wrap up. The work is the progressive improvements. Okay? So then as you flip through here, right, there's kind of like a whole like, how do you manage change and stuff like that. You know, so you guys can look at all of that kind of a thing. And so just so you know, like I had no intentions of actually making it through this, so this wasn't like me mismanaging my time. It was me deciding to clip the scope at 45 minutes.